Please take your seats. Welcome. Hello everyone, hello and welcome everybody to the Symposium Architecture, Connecting Nature and Culture. Thank you so much for joining here in presence at the beautiful MAC Lecture Hall, as well as virtually via the live stream. My name is Nicole Stoecklmayr. I'm the Managing Director of CT Academy, an educational institution offering courses, seminars and events for the continuing professional development of architects and engineers in Austria. As the curator and moderator of today's event, I'm delighted to welcome each and every one of you. And since it is part of the Brick Award 22, first things first, congratulations to all nominees and all the winners for this prestigious international prize. I also would like to express my gratitude to Wienerberger and CEO Heimo Scheuch for hosting the Brick Award and also making possible today's symposium. Having worked closely with the Brick Award project management, also thank you. Before we start our first lecture, let me give you a brief overview over the agenda and issues we will examine today. Climate change, limited natural resources, as well as growing demands and regulatory frameworks for an ecological building culture, which incorporate energy efficiency, sustainability, and preservation, require different architectural approaches. Within these new conditions, how can architects make an impact with their designs and their choices for particular building material, such as bricks? Promising developments are, for instance, buildings which were constructed by using local materials to reduce waste and energy, or creating building envelopes with facade greening. Other means include concept by not demolishing existing buildings, but preserving them by careful conversions and extensions, refurbish, reuse. And a more research-based focus is embraced by architects who develop innovative technologies, processes, and prototypes, such as on-site robotics and digital fabrication in building construction. Altogether, these approaches connect nature and culture by designing architecture that enables an environmentally sustainable future. The symposium speakers will share their insights from their respective fields for a discussion, and this is the big question, how architects can make a substantial contribution for the built environment. And to tackle this very big question, we will have 5 speakers, 4 lectures, and 1 panel discussion. And I want to underline one important thing that all these 5 speakers have in common. They are all heavily engaged in practice, research, and teaching, thus sharing their knowledge by enriching today's architectural discourse. These 5 amazing speakers are Kathrin Dörfler of Technical University of Munich, Lina Ghotmeh of Paris-based practice Lina Ghotmeh Architecture, Wilfried Kuehn of Berlin-based architecture studio Kuehn-Malvezzi, and Lyndon, Neri, and Rossana Hu of Shanghai-based design and research office Neri and Hu. Now a quick look over the logistics and organization of the schedule. Lina Ghotmeh will start as the first speaker, followed by Kathrin Dörfler's lecture. After the coffee break, we will continue with Wilfried Wilfried's presentation, and Lyndon and Rossana are giving the fourth lecture. Speaking of the coffee break, please don't bring your glasses and other things from the buffet in this beautiful lecture hall. So for all of you here at the Mac Lecture Hall, the free Wi-Fi is named Brick Award 22, and the password is Symposium with a capital S. You will also find the Brick Award, of course, on various social media platforms such as Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And if you want to share your thoughts, comments, or pictures on our today's event on social media, you're invited to tag your posts with the hashtag Brick Award. And after the symposium, you'll get the chance to give your feedback on the symposium with the app Mentimeter. So, without any further ado, let this symposium begin. Our first speaker is Lina Ghotmeh. She's the founder of Paris-based atelier Lina Ghotmeh Architecture. She also sits on the board of Saint-Gobain as an independent director. She has lectured internationally and has taught at the École Spéciale d'Architecture as the Louis Kahn visiting professor at the Yale School of Architecture. And she currently holds the Gehry Chair visiting professor at the University of Toronto. Among the many, many prizes and awards she received are the 22 International FD 100 Prize, the 21 Design Project of the Year Award, and the 2020 Schelling Architecture Prize. Her work has been exhibited, and just to name a few, at the last year's Architecture Biennale in Venice, and the Max in Rome, and also the Victoria and Albert in London. Echoing her lived experience in Beirut, Lina Ghotmeh's office work is orchestrated as an archaeology of the future, and we'll now learn what this concept entails. Please give a very warm welcome to Lina Ghotmeh.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nicole, and thank you for inviting me for this wonderful event. Thank you, Wienerberger, and Heimann also for this beautiful, actually, speech yesterday. So we really love brick, we love biosourced material. And I'm excited today to present the way we do works and what's the process of designing, but also maybe focus on one project. Many of you have demanded that to explain it further, which is a tower that we delivered in Beirut. So I start with this photo of Earth that preoccupy us today, knowing that as we are tipping on a tipping point, actually, where we are in an Anthropocenic period and where the human impact is growing on Earth. And also knowing that as human beings, it's outstanding to hear that we are more microbe than we are actually humans. So 43% of our cells are constituted of nature, and only the rest is constituted of human cells. So that always brings me to question how much nature actually in architecture, and how much architecture could be part of the environment. Almost like every act of making becomes that of revealing, of digging, of unveiling something that exists already. Somehow like this image of the obelisk that was found in Egypt, and I'm quite inspired by this photo where this obelisk was not finished yet, and it's emerging as a sculpture from the place itself. And this is our work as architects, always trying to understand history, understand how things had evolved, and how every typology is almost like a Darwinian process where things are changing and we're questioning typologies. And in our office, this kind of questioning take the form of different media, moving from references, from research on the history of a typology, to material work, to model work, to imagery, and really like bouncing between the work of the hand to that of technology. So just kind of thinking of architecture, I tend to think it's somehow between archaeology as of driving the past, between humanity as it's an inclusive act of society, equity, diversity, but also nature. Naturally, we're not, I mean, it's natural that architecture has to drive and be driven by ecology, by the environment that surrounds it. And the future, because every act of making has and pertains an originality in it. And throughout my practice as an architect, growing up in Beirut, I found myself actually working in like very specific sites where there is always a sense of tumultuous past, and thinking about how can architecture be part of a healing, if it may be able to do that, of a context. And one of the first projects that we realized is this museum in Estonia. And what was very particular was this relationship with a Soviet ex-military airfield that just crosses the site and makes out of this museum, or out of the site of this museum, an area that hasn't been very much approached. And in this proposal for the museum, the idea was to kind of link that platform into the National Museum and transform the history of the site through that building. So this kind of scar in context becomes the bearer of a new way of making architecture, and maybe linking the building, the architecture, into an infinite ground, into a ground that is open for constant making of identity and of healing some kind of like all the events that had happened in the past. And the building becomes a place for people where they could gather, where different activity could happen, but also where the structure of the building itself becomes that of opening imagination. And we could see where artists and cinematographers start to kind of appropriate spaces like this structure of the cantilever, and becomes a place for imagination and appropriation, and basically occupy the space in an unpreviewed way. And it's somehow talking about how the generosity of spaces could be a fosterer for meeting points and for activities for people and gathering. And actually the spaces that we struggle as architects to convince the client to make become actually the places where life could happen. So moving from there and from this relationship to the landscape, we're building now in France the first passive low-carbon manufacturing building for Hermès in Normandy. And that's a great exercise to see how a building could be bioclimatic, how it could reduce its impact on the environment. And happily enough, we're using brick for this construction. Brick because it's echoing this kind of work by the hand and going back to this micro scale as in the image of what this building contains, which is making all these leather work, and going to the micro scale, the impact of the hand on architecture, the traces, and how this could be a way to produce a different form in space. So the building is one that is constructed completely by brick with a wooden ceiling. And it's a compact structure that gets nature as part of its architecture. And we had manufactured 550,000 bricks from the earth of the site itself, and using actually the local resources, reducing our carbon footprint by sourcing local material, but also working with a local artisan to make these bricks. So it's an artisanal brick manufacturer. And it's really nice to see how the color of the bricks actually change with the degree of baking of these bricks. And then slowly building up this project, and every material actually used would be calculated in terms of its COV and carbon footprint. One of the things also of brick is going back to this kind of micro scale of putting, of building with care. But also like training again, artisans to be able to build with brick. So this kind of work of the hand is followed in different scales of projects that we do, from the architecture to the interior, and sometimes using back earth also in some of the objects in the inside. And also the kind of a craft being a way to bridge between cultures and to reconnect people together. So moving from this kind of approach of craft and being faced with this project to build in Beirut. Beirut is a city where I grew up, and it's a crazy city. Like, it really kind of manifests all the, let's say, troubles that we're facing in the whole world in a very small geography. We're here very close to the port area where the explosion of 2020 had happened. And Beirut is really a city that had inspired the way I'm approaching architecture, because I grew up in this place where it's a constant archaeology. Every time a building is torn down, we could see like an archaeology emerging. Also, nature just comes through every ruin, and it's really bringing beauty even in a very violent context. So we're always brought back to earth again, and to history, to the history of civilizations as it lived the Ottoman times, the Roman times, and all the different histories actually in this city. It's also the contradiction of how to build a city today, a city for cars, as we see in this photo. And just across this building, seeing housing conditions that portray the issues we're facing with housing in the world at the moment. And we struggle as architects when we get to build certain kind of level of housing. How do we deal with this, and what do we offer back to the city? A city that has been undergoing a lot of change, and as we see here, all these small houses that are reminiscent of the Ottoman times have been disappearing with these towers, the developers' towers. That, not that we hate developers, but maybe we can build differently. So, and they're just repeating the same building. And then sometimes some events that happen, like this explosion, and render everything ashes again. So it shows the position of this building very close to this port area, because Beirut is a portuary city as well. So it had developed next to the sea, to this blue actually, that gives the beauty of that city. And it's also the position of the site of this project is very close to the city center. So the city center of Beirut was completely destroyed after the war, and these are photos of its renovation. And we see almost like a kind of a shiny new city center, city heart, very close to the site of the building. So as we see here, actually this was the existing building on the site. And historically, this building was the first concrete factory in Beirut. So there's this relationship with that material that was established in the Middle East and was very successful at that time. And it's also the first, it's the office building actually of a famous modernist architect, Pierre El-Khoury, who died, and then gave away this land to his son and his family. And his son is a photographer, Fouad El-Khoury. And actually, Fouad wanted to be an architect, but he wanted to be a photographer, and his father didn't want him to be a photographer. He wanted him to be an architect because photography is not a job. So he ended up really struggling and kind of capturing very important moments of the city of Beirut. And in '92, he published, along with 4 other photographers, including Gabriel Basilico, Robert Frank, and Joseph Kodaika, this beautiful book about Beirut. And it really captures the memory of Beirut and of the city center. And this is actually what I grew up with, these moments of buildings that were completely violated, that were completely materialized differently, and that talk about sceneries that we constantly see today, unfortunately. What was for me very kind of touching also is to see how human beings become as their environment, and as you see this man completely frail as the building is behind him. So Stone Garden tries to capture these moments and transform them in a different manner, like these openings become masses, sculpted from the mass. And they try to provide different moments of life within the building itself. So we can see these different scales of opening happening within this mass and this concrete structure. And as the construction happens in concrete, the building tries to respond to a seismic zone, actually, in Beirut. The openings within, and I call them openings because I feel like the idea is to how the window could become more critique or a kind of tool to see the city differently within the household, to maybe frame it, talk about its contradictions, and portray it almost like a photography within the apartments. And these are photos that I took of the outside during construction site, and we could see these moments of Beirut within. This is before the blast, and we see this silo that really kind of iconically sits on the port area. And moments of opening kind of portray the history of what had happened, but also try to make these transform into moments of life where nature could take over, and where every opening talks about a different scale of nature within. So moving from the flower plot into the garden and allowing it to grow within that building. It's also this presence of nature is one that is organic, that is echoing the way it is present in the city, more free, untamed, in a reverse way to the way it exists in Paris, like Place des Vosges, where all the trees are cut down. And actually, this kind of variety of opening allows a variety of apartment spaces and individualize the apartment at every floor, kind of sitting in opposition to these towers behind that, where every floor houses the same typology of apartment. And as we see here, the housing is growing on the upper levels, and on the ground floor is an entrance, and then we go into the intimacy of the apartments within. And these are photos that I was lucky to have, that Iwan Ban had taken actually for Domus just a few months before the explosion. At that time, the project was not completely finished, and he just captured moments of the building that really sits tightly to its side, that really talks about the geometry of the site. But also moments where we can see that the building really reflects on this building regulation that governs the way we make our structures in cities, and sometimes we don't see these, and I wanted to make this visible through the form and through the shape of this building that kind of is sculpted by the city itself. And through nature, it starts to kind of link to the ground. And the ground itself is housing also a foundation for art and image in the Middle East. And it's an open gallery space where different artists could express themselves and are exhibited. And that's actually what we tried to show in the Biennale, is all this life that is happening in Beirut, in a city that is in constant unrest. And the inside of the apartments in the model start to show like the photography work of many artists in Beirut, that also art as a way actually to almost survive and kind of appropriate these moments of disaster that had happened. And we see like also within the processes of making of the building, within these smaller video work. At the moment, for those in the US, this model will be exhibited in the Smithsonian Museum. The facade of the project is one that talks about craft, about artisans, but also about the hands of many migrants from the neighboring war. And that I wanted to incorporate them in the act of making architecture. And so I started thinking about a way to devise a tool, a handmade tool, to comb the whole facade, almost like we're combing or like preparing earth to be planted again. And we started drawing these combs that we would really kind of use to comb the whole elevation, and like kind of reinventing tools of making and going back to artisanal ways of kind of crafting. And this started with these small models in the office that are like clay models that I combed with a fork, and then told the client we will make this. So he panicked, but it worked after. And then the workers and the artisans were really proud of that work, and they were like showing me how they were able to go through the corners and really kind of make this this combing work perfectly. So it was really a fantastic process, because it was a human kind of adventure to be able to do that and to meet this kind of context that is derelict, but also the building just sits in a smaller scale, tries to portray the section that the city of Beirut is through its architecture. And we can see that it cannot be captured in one moment, but really kind of evolves as the city evolves from the different angles. From here, and replying to the question of Lyndon, is the south facade actually of the building. And this facade is bound to be covered, because the exploitation factor actually of Beirut allows that this building could be destroyed one day and just like another tower could be rising up. And what I attempted to do here is to kind of really kind of shape the building in relationship to the site, but allow openings nonetheless. So all these openings are ventilations to toilets, to kitchens, and they could always be remaining as ventilations. So they don't give the main light to the inside, but they're more like secondary openings. They also talk about the snipers that destroyed Beirut during civil war. And after the explosion, which in a way brought back this apocalyptic process again, the building stood like surprisingly well, and the facade was untouched, the nature was untouched, yet inside, of course, all the apartments were completely torn away. And now it's again in renovation, at least all the inside of the apartments. And I really love this photo by Lauriane Guinitou, because it shows like this kind of practice in the Mediterranean cities where we sit outside and we're related to the outside as almost like a private realm. And this building brings this, again, vernacularity almost to this context. And then like kind of sitting with the context, but maybe breaking a little bit also from this context, echoing moments of nature that kind of are brought back into the building. And sometimes like looking really small in relation to this tower. And just finish with a quick preview of this movie. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina, for this wonderful kickoff of our symposium. What I want to mention is that after the 4 presentations, we'll have the panel discussion, and this will also be the moment where all of you as the audience come in, as there will be time for questions, remarks and comments, either specific to one presentation or on our general theme. Okay, I'll start the next presentation, just a moment. Our next speaker is Kathrin Dörfler, who is professor at the School of Engineering at the Technical University of Munich, where she set up the Augmented Fabrication Lab. Her career as an architect started actually here in Vienna, the Technical University of Vienna, but she also studied just next door digital art at the University of Applied Arts. From then, she received her PhD from the ETH Zurich, carried out at Grammatio Cola Research as part of the National Center of Competence in Research in Digital Fabrication. And her doctoral thesis, Strategies for Robotic in Situ Fabrication, was developed in close collaboration with robotic scientists. It conceived methods for using robots for fabrication not only in laboratory environments, but directly on construction sites in combination with architectural design strategies for such robot-made structures. I'm looking forward to finding out more on her work and collaborative fabrication processes, on-site robotics, and fabrication-aware design. Please join me in welcoming Kathrin Dörfler.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation and thank you for this nice introduction. Yes, I called my talk Teaming Up with Robots, and I'll show you what I mean with this in the next 20 minutes. As Nicole already said, my name is Kathrin Dörfler, and I had the professorship for digital fabrication at the Technical University of Munich since 2 years, where I built up the research group named Augmented Fabrication Lab. And with my team, we tried to research how increasingly autonomous machines could lead to new collaborative processes between humans and robots in the architecture, engineering, and construction domain. As you all know, today's machines are not just mechanical, but they are digitally reprogrammable. They are equipped with sensors, smart control algorithms, such that they can be used in many different domains. Thanks to such an increased autonomy, we can use these robots also for architecture, and that means not only for prefabrication and within protected lab environments, but we can also take them out directly to building sites, where, again, sensors and the perception, the understanding of the environment allows such machines to constitute themselves on site and to allow to understand, predict, and to be responsive to the environment, and thus to basically be able to react to unforeseen events, also to material tolerances and to people in their immediate environment. During my PhD, we have demonstrated such an approach for the first time, where in the context of the so-called DFAB house, which was constructed at the EMPA at the ETH Zurich as part of a project to showcase digital fabrication processes. And we have been building the S-shaped reinforced concrete wall at the ground floor of the unit, basically being the main load-bearing element of this two-story house, basically holding this prefabricated cantilevering ceiling on top and then a two-story timber unit. And we could show that we can bring the mobile robot, the so-called in situ fabricator, we named it, to the building site. It's a robot that is built completely with industrial off-the-shelf components, but equipped with a lot of cameras and sensors such that it can basically locate itself and then being able to fabricate, in this case, a steel reinforcement cage according to a predefined three-dimensional model. The mesh is produced with such a density that afterwards the concrete can be filled in, basically being pressed in from the side. And with this basically method, the mesh is basically produced with the geometry intended coming from the 3D model and then is filled up manually and without the need of any additional basically formwork. And Although this research was very successful in many domains, we could show many things, there have been many critical points, and one of them is that our research always intended to basically be intended to substitute human labor, and really not defining the role of the humans in such processes. And when you look carefully into these processes, there are actually a lot of human interventions. Although the research basically intends to minimize them and to really increase the autonomy of these machines, we see people that surround the robots and kind of feed material or trigger the events, or in fact, a lot of time is really literally also just waiting next to them and like kind of watching them perform their tasks. So in the context of human-robot interaction, the main opinion basically suggests that with a very high autonomy of machines, we can minimize the human intervention and therefore basically really make fully autonomous processes, as was also intended with the research shown before. But there's a much more interesting approach to that there's basically a positive correlation between autonomy of machines and collaboration. Meaning that a balanced interaction partnership can only be established with the maximum possible autonomous features of such a robot or machinery. With the machines being able to really understand, predict situations, and therefore being able to interact in the end. So basically not leading to complete isolation, but rather being able to interact. And that means that when I started my professorship at TU Munich, basically this was really the main question that we are now trying to establish or trying to address as a group, is how can we explore new possibilities with putting people into the center and being able to explore which new possibilities arise by really thinking of collaboration, coordination, cooperation, but in combination with highly autonomous agents to work with. So against this backdrop, the project Augmented Brickwork, which has also made it into the catalog, I think, a collaboration with Grammatical Research takes a fundamentally different approach, where we try to hybridize machine intelligence with basically manual building techniques and craft principles.
This sequence, using the tracking system to guide the placement of the bricks.
This is my long-term colleague, Timothy Sandy. He took the sensor system of the mobile robot. The sensor system allows to track discrete objects very precisely in three-dimensional space. But instead of using it to basically locate and control mobile robots, we started to think about how can we instead create visual guidance systems for people to very precisely assemble discrete structures in three-dimensional space. And together with studying the craft of bricklaying, which in this case the feature of basically putting a brick into place by tapping it onto each corner and really pressing it into the still malleable mortar, we developed an interface that translates these crafting principles into visual instructions in real time to guide physical manual actions. And we have developed and tested this approach in 2020 for the construction of a brick facade for a winery in Greece. This is also summed up in this video. So here you can see the brick facade is an infill brickwork in between this concrete frame. This is the view from the outside. And while we have intended first to have like a one-person system, we in the end had to have two people basically use the system. One person who was basically laying down the bricks and filling and cutting the mortar and grouting the mortar joint. Another person helped to measure the brick and track track the element in space. And here you can see the visual interface that would continuously guide the person as to how strong and where this brick needed to be tapped. And you can see this is really a step-by-step process. Each time the brick would be tracked. And then the size of the arrow would basically indicate the amount of force you would need it to apply. The interesting part of this project was really that it is something that can be learned. So over time, basically this team started to almost exponentially increase in time, and it's sometimes even hard to communicate. It is a very intuitive process between the visual guidance that you have and the manual sort of manipulation that you do. In the end, we have been able to construct this brick facade, which has this creates this shadow image in the facade through the rotation of the brick, and also the layers are not completely flat; they are more the horizontal joint is a bit waved to kind of enforce this three-dimensional effect. Yeah, and basically the sun creates a shadow effect, and therefore this draws this sort of waves into the facade. Yeah. And then we were so excited about these new possibilities that we have been now exploring different aspects of it. We show you one of it, which is a collaboration between our professorship and then the startup that has emerged from the previous project named Incon AI. And we investigated how not just a single person can be instructed, but actually a team of people can be guided. And following basically user-specific and user-dependent instructions on a mobile phone. The project is called LOCKS for interlocking, in which digital building instructions can be retrieved by multiple users at the same time, not on the video screen as you have seen before, but actually really on your mobile phone. And the research question in this case revolved around how the construction progress can be synchronized via cloud-based tools via the app, so that several users can intuitively log in, participate, or log out at any time of the process. This is also now a stop because
we enable collaborative building using augmented reality tools. The project is a cooperation between the two professorships of digital fabrication and structural design and Zurich-based startup Incon AI. In LOCKS, the users can retrieve building instructions via the mobile AR app, which superimposes the building instructions over the physical structure.
Participants can log in as users by pointing their phone to any QR code to visualize the digital model of the pavilion overlaid on the physical structure. By doing so, they will show the instructions on how to participate in the building the model, as well as specifically the elements they can build visualized in green. They can choose and select any of these elements to their wish, and once this element is placed in the real world, they can set this as build, and this action will unlock new buildable elements visualized on the screen.
By following these instructions, users can build complex structures without the need of additional measurement tools or printed plans.
This coordination will enable multiple users to participate building the LOCKS pavilion together at the same time.
So we developed the project as part of our design studio last semester, and the initial idea was to create a building system which would consist only of a single element that would offer a variety of interlocking connections. And our main inspirations were games for children and wooden blocks for children, and we kind of scaled it up for adults to create a kind of a playful and creative project.
For the Kunstareal Festival, we developed this specific design, resembling a weaving pattern that is also enhanced by the use of color. The structure does not only employ the material, as a building material, but also as a support during the construction. After the event is over, we will disassemble the pavilion and we will rebuild it at the campus of TUM, of course, with a new design.
Based on the principle of topology interlocking structures, LOX offers a variety of form-fitted connections that make use of only one component type. This component type is made of timber and due to its interlocking mechanism does not require any additional connection elements in order to assemble different or multiple elements together.
LOX is shown for the first time at the Kunstfest in Munich, in which we collaboratively built a pavilion together with our students. The overall aim of LOX is to make building processes more tangible and accessible to the public and to encourage community participation. In order to create a sense of belonging and responsibility in our cities, one can imagine that systems like LOX will enable residents to build and rebuild their own jointly created structures for and by themselves.
Yep. So yeah, these are some views from the exhibition. It was basically constructed in 2 days and then deconstructed the day after because of COVID regulation. This is the beautiful space in front of the Alte Pinakothek across the university. We had a beautiful weather, yeah, and these are some of the impressions of the structure as it remained. Yeah, and I close my talk with a very small project with a brickwork, again, climate active bricks, a project that we did in collaboration, again, with the professorship for climate aware building envelopes, Philip Malta and then Ata Chokachian last summer. And with these projects, we wanted to investigate how we bring collaborative robots onto building sites. And yes, it works. It's quite easy. It's a 3-day workshop, and the project had one very simple idea. We applied this so-called red trap bond, which is a bond where 4 bricks are built in this configuration, such that there's an air cavity in between, which means that the front brick can be shifted and then also rotated, which gives some design freedom to create a self-shadowing effect in the wall. And yes, again, this is summarized in a video, so
in the context of climate change and especially of sealed surface in very dense urban environments, microclimates are a very sensitive, important aspect of our well-being.
It's already well accepted that the cities are shaping the microclimate, and the microclimate is shaping how people are using and experiencing the cities and the urban environments. One of the effective methods to encourage people to use the public space is to give them comfort opportunities, meaning to create cold spots in the city to recover from the heat stress. This can be done either by planting trees or creating surfaces with minimized solar exposure.
Sometimes we cannot increase the greenery of our cities, so we need to lower surface temperature of our urban walls. We do this by adding a shadow surface, so we can lower the surface temperatures by creating shaded walls of our buildings.
The project Climate Active Bricks is about combining the research field of improving urban microclimate and the field of robotic fabrication. Robotic fabrication allows us to directly fabricate from a digital model. So the geometries that we generate by utilizing simulation tools can directly be fabricated one-to-one by a robotic arm.
The Climate Active Bricks project is a good example of an experiment enabled by digital tools through the entire design process, from conceptualization to the fabrication.
So with this project, we also tried to combine human craftsmanship and robotic fabrication. We actually use the robotic manipulator only for the precise laying of the brick, whereas other tasks like putting the mortar or mixing the mortar, that we would combine with the students' works. When we perform the simulation, the goal is to reach the minimum solar exposure. That means that the geometry of the brick wall results in a geometry where each brick has an individual location. So it would be very difficult for a human to build this wall. So in this case, we exploit robotic fabrication because it allows us to directly take the result of the simulation and fabricate it into millimeter accuracy.
We improve the human comfort level by lowering surface temperature in the urban context. So far, we can say that the lowered surface temperature reduces the heat stress on the human body. Normally, our urban walls are very flat surfaces. So what we do by creating a staggering pattern of brick walls, we generate self-shadowing effects in the wall that allows to reduce the surface temperature of that wall.
Promoting people to use the public realm is highly dependent on how walkable, comfortable, and healthy we plan our cities.
Yep. Okay. So let me briefly restate a few points. While we'd like to take technological challenges into our work, we still try to create an alternative vision of a fully automated production. Instead, sort of proclaim a hybrid human-robot work team that can complement each other to increase flexibility, freedom of design, areas of application, but also some sort of social sustainability. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathrin, for giving us glimpses into your exciting research projects. We'll now have a break of 15 minutes outside waiting refreshments for you. And we'll come back in 15 minutes for Wilfried Kuehn's talk. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed so far. Thank you. please take your seats. Welcome back. Please take your seats. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Wilfried Kuehn. He's an architect, curator, and partner of the architecture studio Kuehn-Malvezzi. Kuehn-Malvezzi conceives architecture as a cultural practice that addresses social and political relationships beyond typological categories. The office became internationally known for its redesign and expansion of numerous museum buildings. Kuehn-Malvezzi, over the past 10 years, has expanded its portfolio to include buildings on complex inner city sites, residential construction, and designs on an urban scale. Kuehn-Malvezzi's work has been shown in various international exhibitions, including several Venice Architecture Biennales, as well as the first and second Chicago Architecture Biennale. Wilfried Kuehn is also a professor here in Vienna. He's professor of spatial design at the University of Technology. And of course, he also served as one of the jury members of this year's Brick Award. So please join me in welcoming Wilfried Kuehn.
Thank you very much, Nicole, for your introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak. We face a moment of planetary relevance. Our relation to nature, or what we call nature, needs a redesign, or needs to be redesigned thoroughly. And a crucial part of this process of redesign will be the fostering of a new understanding and a new way of thinking, the representations of what we call the natural. Our understanding, like this Baroque image by Salomon Kleiner here in Vienna from the Belvedere, actually, just as the Natural History Museum in New York and the dioramas there, they all tell us something about a way of understanding nature and a way of preserving it, classifying it, displaying it, that somehow cements a division between us and nature. There is a gap. We don't think of ourselves as being part of nature. We look at nature on display when we go to the Natural History Museum and when we put animals in a zoo. And nature, if we look more closely, is made up of animals we hardly know, like insects, who account for 85% of animal diversity. And also insects, we have a hard time connecting with, not least because they're very small. And they have been here for 400 million years on the Earth. 400 million years of insects. Humans are a shorter episode of planetary life. Humans will be gone, and insects will still be there for many more million years. So we should respect also the insects. So if we look back at our human history of classifying and showing, displaying nature, we look at roughly 400 years of the museum. And In this way, we look at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, of course, and we look at as one of the first, maybe the first in the 17th century of natural history museums. We look, of course, at the Biosphere 2 as some kind of wild experiment in creating an artificial environment in the United States in the more recent time. And we also look, for instance, back at the Great Exhibition in London in 1851 as such experiment of explaining and showing nature in a more industrial way. And we look at, of course, also at the biosphere of Bucky Fuller that you see here in Montreal, that actually is a starting point for our project that I want to show in a moment. I think in order to make the next step, we have to acknowledge, first of all, the destructive history we have with nature. And we have to reshape our design approach. The biosphere of Bucky Fuller from '67 was made for the Expo in Montreal, and it's part of that kind of museum complex in Montreal that is called Espace pour la Vie, Space for Life, which is a aggregation of museums that connect different, it's Canada's largest, I have to say, museum complex of natural science. It's in the Botanical Garden also of Montreal. It's the Biodome in Montreal. And it's also the Insectarium, so the Museum of Insects. And I want to go deeper into that museum that we did a redesign for. It was actually demolished and rebuilt in the last 3 years. It has been an Insectarium since '91, and it didn't fit its purpose anymore because of the reasons I explained and how things were shown, how things were displayed. So this was our first diagram. We drew basically as a driver for the project. It's a figure ground diagram where from space and objects you move to objects, or from objects in space, I would say you move to being within space. And I would say that this embodies a bit the approach we had for designing the Insectarium. It was first also a ground plan. It then didn't hold that. But what was interesting for us is actually to explore a different relation between us and the space. So we worked together with landscape architects Atelier Le Balteau, who are French but Berlin-based. And it's them actually in the garden here, in one of their gardens. They also work in the gardens. They not only design but also implement their gardens. And they designed the Insectarium and other projects I will show from day one together with us. And I think this is quite important also. If we design with and for nature, we should perhaps include landscape architects into the process from day one and not just, as usually it happens afterwards or at a late stage, to fill the external gaps or spaces with green. So, going to Montreal, or back to Montreal, we look at the Botanical Garden. We see the Insectarium, which is the red spot in there. And I would say what we tried here is actually to go one step further, being the museologists and the architects, because we won a competition that was combining these two questions, and we did it all ourselves instead of hiring an external museologist, because we also do a lot of museum architecture and museology. And working on architecture and museology at once was actually the key, together with the landscape, involvement of landscape, to actually design the museum not as a box that you fill with museology and insects, for instance, but actually to design an experience and actually make the spaces of the museum follow that idea. So we started from the greenhouse as a typology, and the Botanical Garden of Montreal is full of greenhouses, and so we just built another one that is, you see here, it's just finished. The external spaces are still not planted, as you can see. And the way we started is actually to make something that in the Botanical Garden would not be even perceived at first glance as a museum building, not as a solitary event, but something that happens there. So we designed the experience first as a kind of cycle that happens, going all around with the visitor being somehow en route, being on a parcours, being somehow immersed and destabilized at the same time into an experience where the architecture would be a performative one and not a box. We started with Le Balteau and a butterfly garden welcoming you outside. So it's all about the plants there, because the plants have been designed in such a way that they can actually accommodate and attract those butterflies like the monarch, which is very important for Montreal, because in the summer months they spend the time there, in the winter they go to Mexico, like birds. They really go in big chunks back and forth between the south and the north of America. And it's very interesting because there's somehow a link to a bigger scale of animal diversity that you just perceive a small glimpse of in the summer. And we then have the way down to the greenhouse, and next to the greenhouse you have this strange mound, kind of like a big pile of earth that you see at the lower part. And this pile of earth is landscaped by Le Balteau, and it changes according to the seasons. Of course, right now, just being finished, it's not yet visible as a landscape, but it will become an element of landscape, of strange landscape within the botanical garden. Some surprise, some moment of you don't know what it is, and underneath it actually is a museum. Underneath it is a vaulted domed space, like a classical domed museum space, and inside are the butterfly collections, the only part of the whole museum or the whole insectarium where actually dead animals are shown, and they're shown according to the color, chromatic schemes and themes that make up insect and other, especially butterfly life. So they're basically a lecture in entomology and in beauty at the same time. And this is a close-up of one vitrine, and it's amazing when you look at them. It looks like works of art. It's just outstanding, the beauty of these and insects, to look at them close up. But the visitor, meanwhile, before getting there, actually enters a kind of a labyrinth, and through the labyrinth walks and destabilizes themselves in the process of going through the museum, and then hitting on the first vitrines where actually living animals are exposed and exhibited, who crawl around. And since your position to the vitrine is put in such a way that you're really close up, you actually see them face to face. And this is an amazing experience I made myself. It's amazing how close suddenly an insect feels to you, and how you can identify with each part of that animal, although it's so small, just because your body position has been changed. And so it's about also our body position in the museum, for instance, that we maybe have to rethink. And then you actually re-emerge from that underground walk, this earthen atmosphere, and you go upstairs, and there you arrive in a Grand Vivarium, it's called, where you see ants carrying leaves, where you see butterflies. They also land on your shoulder, they land everywhere. They take architecture, whatever is there, as their airport. And basically, it's like full immersion now in this tropical butterfly house within the greenhouse, where you really feel immersed in their environment. And this is just pure experience. And after having seen them in so different ways before and actually being confronted with them, and I couldn't show you now the particular 6 rooms in which you actually go through the experience of understanding their way of looking, their way of having balance, their way of seeing and living through rhythm and vibrations and so on, because that is all experiential, and you have to go there to see and to feel yourself. But after that, you're actually now immersed with them in this big space. That is a classical butterfly garden, of course, but at the same time also is a place where you can somehow gather with others and reshape your way of looking at it. And that happens through an atelier, a workshop space where that is totally in the middle of everything. And in this workshop space, school classes and also other groups of visitors can gather by appointment, but also spontaneously. And things are being done together there, always with reference to the animal world of the insect. So the whole idea is also that you become an active part of a process in the end. And this is a classical greenhouse within the greenhouse, where the plants are being prepared for the Grand Vivarium, because these insects feed on them and they need constant new plants to come in for the pollination. So this is a very beautiful just world of cycle. The cycle I showed you in the beginning basically also includes the idea of production. And production, which stand in the center of that diagram, is also the production of plants. And here you see the strange dome that is still not planted because it's just finished. And it's still winter, or it was winter in Montreal 3 months ago when this was taken. It just opened, and next year we will probably see the first kind of overgrowing of that dome. And I think one aspect of that is also very important to understand is that we have to have a more process and time-based understanding of architecture, where things happen over time. They're not always the same. And that is something we can learn from landscape architects. They think their gardens in 10 and 20 and 30-year times, and they're always finished in a different way. And our architecture has to be finished on day X, and we hand it over. But that's not the way architecture works. It has a time process built in, and we have to conceptualize that further. So this is the floor plan in a negative white-black, nollie-like configuration. So the space is black, and you actually kind of feel how it is very labyrinthian and very strange architecture for us who have never built anything similar. It was really an exercise in finding, through the museology, actually hold of this idea of going underground and finding the appropriate form for it. And in this section, you recognize all the stages together. So talking about greenhouses brings me to the next project, because greenhouses, we discovered through this insectarium project after winning the competition in 2015, actually greenhouses are very, very, very potentially strong typologies. We can do a lot with them. And so the next project, another competition we won, was based on the idea that a greenhouse could be the top of a normal office building in the middle of a German city in Oberhausen, a depressed city in the west where steel works and coal once dominated, and now, unfortunately, high rates of unemployment, of deindustrialization, basically emptied the center. The city center is empty and it's depressed. And in the city center, right on the old marketplace, a building was called for, basically the assessment center. So that's very of course poignant. And our decision to fulfill the brief and actually create a public space on top of the building, enlarging the city onto the roof, creates, with the greenhouse there, a new way of understanding also the whole question of life cycle of a building and circular fluids in the building. Because what happens now is that an office building which has so much CO2 in the offices as extra, actually in the greenhouse being transformed into chlorophyll, makes plants grow. So instead of having exhaust air from the offices, the bad air, the human bad air, we have to say, goes into the greenhouse and creates plants, so creates chlorophyll. This cycle also includes water cycles, includes rainwater cycles that are being reused in the building, and so on. And so these strawberries that you see here, actually, I happen to taste, and actually they taste wonderful. And this is not always the case when you taste a strawberry in Germany or a basil or salad in Germany, because what happens usually is that these things come from some other places. They come from either the Netherlands, so the polder landscape, always fascinating, because Cartesian, for so many hundred years already, a land completely dedicated to the exploitation of agriculture in a very organized way. And of course, you have the same now, even stronger, and even more problematic in the south of Spain. Almeria, I think you know the name, Andalusia. So we basically, for the last 20 years, shifted most of our agricultural production for cheap agriculture to that place. That place is a place where 50% of vegetables and fruits that are consumed in Europe are being grown. And how do you do this? I mean, you have, of course, not enough water there, so there's dehydration of the soils. You don't have enough workers there, so you have seasonal workers from North Africa who work there, and who work there for 30 to 35 euros, but not per hour, per day, of course. And you can imagine what that means in the European Union. And you have other problems. For instance, the CO2 footprint of that salad that goes from there, or that fruit that goes from there to Oberhausen, if it has to travel. Once it arrives, it already has done 2,000 kilometers. So you ask yourself, is that really sustainable? Or should we maybe really bring back food production into our cities, if we can? Also because it tastes better, not least at the end. And so to actually build a greenhouse on top of an office building is not so strange, and it could be actually a blueprint and a model case for other buildings. So our ambition here was to show that it's possible, to make it work, to integrate it also, if you look at the facade, in such a way that actually it doesn't look like a ready-made put on top afterwards, but actually, as we did it, it's built in. So the windows, the steel frames, everything grows out of it. We kind of found a way to make the windows and the greenhouse to become really one typological element. And we use stack-bound brick, so the brick here is just cladded. It's just cladding. The brick is not self-load-bearing or self-carrying. We made it obvious by actually using a bond that is not structural. We used very simple materials inside, concrete. We used just very simple ceiling coverings and lamps. So everything is very nude. It can be changed over time. That was one of the big points for us, resilience, typologically speaking, to have a skeletal structure that is an office building today, but it can become a residential building or anything else tomorrow, because we have room height, we have skeletal structure, we have big windows, and a very sturdy layout. So you can do with this building many things. And then the question was, so how do we connect this public space on top of a building with the public market below that you see here in the image? And that was then the point where Le Balteau, our landscape architects, came in once again, and they were there from the beginning actually, because that was the point we made in the competition. You need a vertical park, a garden that connects them, that is not so much only about being green, but about being a movement, being a parcours, connecting the upper and the lower parts. And you have this kind of interplay between the steel structure and the brick. And actually, it's a gap. It's a gap between the neighbor building and the new office building, a gap to be filled, to be used, and to be grown. So basically, the garden grows up step by step. It's also a process. This was 2 years ago, or 3 years ago by now, and it's growing. And it grows from the soil up because there's no ceiling. We don't have a garage below. The whole soil is actually not sealed. We use the roof intensely, but we don't seal the ground. And I think this is very important, to think about our cities as places where there's less ceiling, where there's more earth, and that can be in different levels in different ways. And of course, the city center that we see here, this is the marketplace now. The old church is still there, the monument is still there, the new building with its public sphere leading up is now there. But of course, there is the question how these cities can actually survive as places also of cultural and human interaction, maybe taking the question of religion into account. Here, of course, this church is functioning in a totally autonomous way. But I will show you now another project where we actually started from exactly this question. How could, in a central spot of a city, religion once again play a role without being that old religion that we know? And I will speak briefly about a place in Berlin, in the very center of Berlin, that looks like this today. It's part of East Berlin, it's part of Berlin Mitte, the very central part. It's an archaeological site also. You can discern that with that kind of building there in the middle, temporary. It's a big street also. It's also social housing from the GDR, from the socialist time, but also some old buildings in between. It's the southern part of the island that you know as the Museum Island. Everyone has been in the museums of Schinkel and of Stühle and to the Pergamon Museum. They are in the north, as you can see here, of that island, the tip. And the southern part, where the red spot is, that's where the spot is we talk about. It's the oldest documented site in Berlin. It's the first documented site because it was, and it used to be, the church of medieval Berlin. Berlin is a young city. It only stems from the medieval times. There's no Roman past. But these are the first documents we have. And there were 5 or 6 churches in the times, in the centuries. They were always burned down or fell down or were renovated or were done differently. And the last one was eliminated with war damages and then taken down by the socialist government in the 60s. So basically, now it's an empty lot, but you still have the foundations underneath. They were excavated, they were looked at, they were documented. And then when the competition came, it's already 10 years ago. The project has not yet been built. It's a slow thing. also a question, well, what does that mean for the architecture? But when we did the competition in 2012, we decided to actually build on top of the ruins. So we said, let's excavate them, and we won with this concept to actually build the full perimeter on top of it. So you see that we cannot, because the street is also cutting and also we didn't want to cross, we built actually on top of that old perimeter wall, actually putting our loads even into it. That is, of course, a crazy thing, which doesn't work, but we won the competition anyway. And there is a way, of course, to making it work, but the idea of actually not treating the historical architecture as a museum, then make a glass plate, and then build something hovering on top, but actually say we attach ourselves to it, I think this is the argument. And this is very important, because it actually is a different understanding of what the city is, of what history is. It's not something we look at with a distance like a diorama, it's something we relate to, we touch, we actually build right on top on. So the shape of the building is formed by that. And what is this building? I haven't even talked about this because the whole idea for this building is somehow very peculiar, and architects don't usually start from the content, they start from other concerns. We usually start from morphological concerns, material concerns. We don't start from the idea that the building is typologically so specific that we can only do one particular thing. This building should have become a church because the community got the property back. The Christian community, it's a Protestant one, St. Petri on that place. But they decided not to build a church. They decided to call a Jewish and a Muslim community to build a house together, which is called the House of One, where there is a synagogue, a mosque, and a church in one building, all separate, but then also all in one building. So the question was, how can actually three monotheistic religions, all with reference to Abraham, of course, but also, and one God, but also very different in their family history, so to speak. They are distant cousins maybe now, or close maybe, but they are not the same, and they don't want to become the same, and it's also not the idea to make them into a world religion. So how can they actually inhabit this house together? So for instance, the fact that the cross of the historical foundations was gone was actually good, because a cross would have been very much a church, right? So we started from this T-shaped, and as you see in the elevation, it's a brick building, and we decided to use brick here, not for the reason that all the last two churches had been in brick there. That was not our argument. Brick is a material that in Berlin is used usually for public buildings. Schinkel used it for the church. He used it also for the Bauakademie. It's used for the municipality. Brick is not used usually in private buildings, but it's used for public buildings and for industry. We thought it made sense in that somehow understanding of the publicness of the building to use brick and to use it outside and inside at the same rate. So to not make a building that is outside brick and then like a cladding like the other building I showed and inside something else. No, we decided from the very beginning that the brick would be used like a block, like a monolith, like a sculpture, where actually inside and outside are the same, and where you would carve out the building out of the brick block, and it becomes somehow the outside publicness becomes inside publicness. So we actually create an urban space inside. It's very sculptural, following basically the ground plan that comes from the historical remnants. The building not having many windows, but is being skylit and very occasionally lit from the outside, also has a monumental sculptural quality because of that, and that of course is very good for a brick construction that is massive. It's actually 94 centimeters thick. It's one massive wall. There's no insulation. There is no plaster. It's just one massive brick wall sitting on the old foundations, but of course with the help also of some more foundations that we had to put deep down, because otherwise that would have been too much of a load. It's 40 meters high. And inside, it's really carved out, as I said. So basically, we had to also now study how to work with brick in such a way that you could actually create these spaces that are partly vaulted and domed. Partly, we also used concrete slabs, where we wanted to have just very simple flat ceilings. You see the archaeological site below that is still there. the spaces actually start a bit higher, the usable spaces. So basically the museum is part of the experience. It's not separate. And you see that every space has a very different form inside, but the form derives basically from the perimeter plan, not so much from the inside out. And this was our competition diagram. We have a synagogue on the right, a church on top, and a mosque on the left. And in the center, we have a fourth space that works like a public square. So the idea that actually you reach all the three sacred spaces on one level inside through a fourth space that acts like a square. It was very much the Jerusalem idea, of course. You have this city and you feel like all these religions are here, and basically they share a city like a publicness, a public sphere, a public square that you can actually experience as one if you are there. And I actually happened to be in Jerusalem during the time we did the competition by chance, and it was really very inspiring to see that kind of cohabitation of religion in the city of Jerusalem. And you feel when you're there that this is necessary, that you create this one level for all of them, and you don't, for instance, pile them up. So inside, this fourth space became very important because it's basically an empty space that is not defined by program, but in its emptiness, it actually creates potential, possibility to rethink the relation between the three religions, and not rethink it once, rethink it permanently, constantly, to actually redefine what religion can be, where you can do things together and where you want to be separate, and what you want to do maybe if you are not religious at all, as most Berliners are. Because in Berlin, this population is largely secular. We had a wall that separated a socialist East from a liberal West, both competing not in religious fervor, but in all sorts of economical and other political emblems. So basically, Berlin is a secularized city, much more than Vienna, for instance. Also, what Berlin has is a very strong Turkish population. Roughly 10% of the population is Muslim, and it's growing. And what Berlin also has is a growing Jewish community, because after the wall came down, many Jewish people from East Europe moved back to Germany, and especially Berlin is now the largest Jewish congregation in the German-speaking world. So basically, Berlin is a growing Jewish city too. And you have some synagogues in the center. You have still many churches. There's no mosque in the center. There are 80 mosques in Berlin, but they are all in the periphery. And this says something about a society, because of course Muslims also live and especially work in the center. And so to have a mosque right here in this very spot is also a very important moment and of claim in terms of cohabitation of religion in the center of a city, and how to actually make this then work, starting from the perimeter, filling it out. And we filled it out conceptually, of course, to carve it then again, and then to create these threshold spaces that actually lead from the fourth space to the sacred spaces, where you have foot washing and all other ritual preparations, and then the three spaces, of course, and where we design now the liturgical objects. And then, because we also thought religion isn't all, you need this post-religious moment, we actually designed this loggia on top, where actually the view goes out, and the feeling is that you could also meditate there and have a transcendent moment without strictly religious aims and reasons. And I think that was the most important part for us, to actually design this space that was not in the brief, as our space somehow is our take on this project. And using brick here was not so much a choice only of religious means, it was a choice also of cultural means, because the building culture of brick that we have to bring back to our cities here has also a moment of ecological sustainability. The brick is an inert, the massive brick wall, I have to say, is an inert wall. It contains the energy. It is cool in the summer, like old sacred buildings are, and it's relatively warm in the winter without much heating. So what it actually does, it does away with the MEP, it does away with the technology inside the building as added material. And it's pure architecture in that sense, because the heating and the cooling is largely done through inertia. And this is something we have to learn again, we have to bring back to our legislation. And I think it's one of the biggest challenges for these years to come, to actually create a building culture once again. Thank you very much. .
Thank you, Wilfried, for showing us these various projects and hinting a bit on the topic I want to address in the panel discussion. But before we start the panel discussion, we'll have the fourth lecture, one moment, by Lyndon, Neri and Rossana. They are the founding partners of Neri and Hu Design and Research Office. And alongside their design practice, Lyndon and Rossana have been deeply committed to architectural education and have lectured across the globe in various universities and professional forums. They recently finished teaching as design critics in architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. They are currently teaching as design critics at Yale, where they have received the distinguished Norman R. Foster Visiting Professor Chair in 2018. And Rossana is also the chair of the Department of Architecture at Tongji University since 2021. Lyndon and Rossana are also founding partners of Design Republic in Shanghai since 2004, a design platform incorporating retail concept, design and cultural exhibitions and education. The work of Neri and Hu has been widely exhibited, most recently until spring this year in a solo exhibition at the Maxi in Rome. And I also want to highlight their second monograph, Thresholds, Space, Time and Practice, which was published by Thames and Hudson in 2021. Lyndon, Neri and Rossana received so many awards and prizes that I just want to name their latest win, which is of course the Brick Award 22 in the category Building Outside the Box. Please give a very warm round of applause to Lyndon, Neri and Rossana.
Nicole, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to try to speak Viennese. Guten Tag, everyone. That's all I know how to say. And Danke-san, that's it. It's 12:40. I know most of you are probably very hungry. Our lecture is supposed to be finished by 12:30. So I think we're over. So we're going to try to do this in 20 minutes.
We'll do it in 2 minutes.
If we fight, we are a couple. Rossana and I tend to kind of fight over things. Our kids have to deal with all this tension in our life. So it's not just about old and new. It's also about the friction that makes this kind of collaboration interesting. Our practice is based in Shanghai. We're a multidisciplinary practice, intentionally located in Shanghai, in a city where we started 15 years ago when we went back, 16 years ago to be specific, and intentionally put ourselves in the midst of major construction and destruction. Things were getting destroyed, and given the fact that we work with other offices, no one was going to give us buildings, so we start engaging in sort of design platform, education, interior designs, product designs, and with a number of sessions, we did a number of books, all theoretical books, not built architecture, up until maybe 7 years ago when we started our first architectural project by luck, because the client didn't really know much better. But with that, okay, where's the tag? People want to see buildings and not me just talked. So that's a blurry image of our latest office. Poor group of people, they were living under construction, and we did this intentionally. It's kind of blurry, isn't it? Interesting. Here it's very clear. Unfortunately, you can't see it, sorry. But and this is illegal in most part of the world, but in China, we were kicked out of our office. We were given 6 months, and so they were living in here while we were building the outside. I know in Vienna or in Germany or parts of Europe, we probably would lose our license, but we're in China, so I think construction moved on. So with that, I want to give sort of Rossana a time to describe this idea of one of our obsessions.
Okay, and it is very difficult for us to have to do a lecture of 20 minutes. I don't think we've ever done it, and both of us together also. But I want to thank Wilfried for bringing up this idea of destruction of nature. And for us, I think what you will, we will speak about 5 projects, believe it or not, within 20 minutes. Again, it's a difficult task. I want to open with this idea of reflective nostalgia, because instead of kind of the idea of or thinking about the destruction of nature, we have recently been thinking a lot about the destruction of culture, and therefore history and the city and the past of the cities that we live in. And particularly in China, I think you will see a lot of this kind of relationship that we're trying to grapple with. How does an architect who should be kind of producing new work and facing the future, but then how do we respond to this idea of nostalgia? And I think nostalgia, here, I know it's not a school lecture, but let's just take a moment and go back to the word of this compound word of nostos, which means homecoming, and algos, which means pain or ache. And believe it or not, it used to be considered as a real medical condition. So you were given, medication for being nostalgic. But of course, we all know that it's really a mental condition. And nowadays, one of the problem of our nostalgia, can you help me click? Yeah, is this idea of being nostalgic for the home that we remember. And in Shanghai, on the left side, this is a typical kind of nongtang, or the lane that we live in. And in fact, we live in one of these lanes where, every neighbor, they share vegetables, and if you're missing garlic for your next meal, then you just knock on the next door. And this is how really people used to live. But then on the other, right next to it, you see Michael Wolff's photography, which captures this alarming trend of urbanization. So this is something that we've been thinking a lot about. And so working in such a city, how do we confront this past and this history? So here we're looking at the idea of reflective nostalgia versus restorative nostalgia. Very quickly, restorative nostalgia would be kind of bring that church back to in Berlin that Wilfried just talked about, maybe restoring it exactly the way it were, as if it's frozen in time. But we all know time moves on. And so how do we grapple with bringing history towards the future, kind of facing the future and creating something anew? And so I think this is, quite timely that we're talking about this issue after seeing Wilfried's project in Berlin. And so the first project that Lyndon's going to talk about is this vertical Langhaus.
So in light of that obsession, we were called by, this is our first architectural project, and I know a lot of you have written me personally in my Instagram account as to how you guys find me, and not my office account, to show this rather old project. This was about done 12 years ago. We didn't have any architectural project. We were desperate. We were just doing interiors and chairs and cups. So when someone asks you to do a project on the Bund, there's only 36 buildings on the Bund if you've been to Shanghai. So naturally, my arrogant side think, oh, wow, I'm going to be one of the 36? Sounds good. We should do this. So we were really excited, thinking that I'm going to put a new insertion among the 36 building along the Bund. Well, I was wrong. This was the building. It was south of the Bund. They forgot to tell me it was south of the Bund. And so I said, oh, this is really crazy. It's another interior project. We really do not want to do this. But the second request, the first request was to demolish it. The second request scared me more. The second request was to do a building like Mayfair in London with all bricks. I know this is a brick award. We could have gotten a brick award if we did the brick, right? But I then said to myself, this is absolutely crazy. Why Mayfair, London? And this is a typical kind of Chinese Singaporean developer that want to be Europe more than Chinese. So I said, in our typical Chinese survival matter, I said, if you demolish this, it'll be very expensive to build Mayfair. This will be very cheap. It'll be half of the cost if you keep it. I was lying, but so the idea was to really take on Italo Calvino's notion that you go to a foreign place, you actually will find things that you do not know and you do not see. It takes a foreigner to appreciate the land that you lived in. So we're just going to go through this rather fast. So we kept the existing structure. We added this corten steel on top because this is by the Huangpu River, where the river is. So you can kind of see the relationship with old and new. But what's interesting is sort of the sectional quality as well on the inside. My mother came and visited us and visited this building and asked me 2 questions. Did the client pay you in full? I said, yes, they did. Second question is, well, first, is the project complete? I said, yes. And second question is, did they pay you in full? I said, yes. He goes, either the client's really stupid or you're a genius. So let's keep it at not the client being stupid, but I'm a genius. So, so with that kind of intensity of old and new, this was rather, talking about reflective nostalgia, this was rather new. In fact, we lost 2 major projects because some of our clients saw this and they thought we were just making fun of the city. But that was our intention, that not just all historical landmark building should be preserved. Some of the buildings with integrity needs to be kept because they preserve the livelihood, the neighborhood, the city, and sort of the community that made Shanghai what it is today. But there is this tendency to always erase community, erase memory, erase everything of the past and creating something new. So when Rossana and I started our practice 15 years ago, and this was 12 years ago when we did this, it was rather radical to a point when the tourism board was really upset at us because they thought we were destroying the beautiful Shanghai Pudong skyline, even though this is just across from it. But you can kind of see sort of the intensity of what we call the vertical city, to bring in the idea of the lane houses, because as Rossana said, people actually share. So that's the cheapest room. So when you check in, that is one of the rooms that looks down. There are rooms, and we kept the patina and the marking. And when you're in your room, someone up above can actually see it. It's extremely sectional. There's only 19 rooms. We were foolish. We designed all 19 rooms. You know, most hotel differently because we just want to design so badly. But what's interesting is these are the existing stairway that we kept, and this used to be a Japanese army warehouse, and people have different stairways because they actually store opium and drug-related stuff. And so what happened is when the police come, they go different stairways and different pockets, right? So we thought by keeping this, it would be kind of interesting, sort of the patina of the building. Obviously, the client was not convinced, and I said, look, you don't have to buy artwork. These are your artwork, and you will sort of see this meandering stairs. Some lead you to other floors, some not. So I'm just going to show you quickly the film. Do I have to press more? Yes. We also made a conscious effort about 10 years ago to start filming our project because architecture is not just about drawings, beautiful rendering, and beautiful perspective. We actually need to, I know it's very different from real life, but I know given the quarantine right now, most of you can't even go. And so the country is completely closed like the olden times. I hope I don't get trouble by saying that. But this actually allows you to bring you to our building and experience sort of some of the things we're talking about. We didn't even curate the people who were checking in and checking out of the place. So 2 years after this was completed, the football player, is it Beckham? Yeah, London player, Beckham, and his wife booked the whole building for a week, and they stay here for a whole week. And it was then that the tourism board came to us and go, maybe you guys know something that we do not know. Interesting, 2 years before that, we were completely rejected. We were thrown, from kind of the idea of us being cultural ambassador to relegated to losing projects. But what was interesting was after that kind of visitation, they actually put us on the front page of the tourism board without really understanding what it is. But what's interesting with this 19-room is sectionally you actually see the restaurants. It's too bad we limit our slides, but you actually see sort of the relationship between all 19 rooms. Not all together, sometimes 3 rooms connect. And in many ways, it starts to reflect the community that is very much the lane houses in Shanghai, because you smell, even our house, we have this big window. If I don't take my curtain down, my neighbors see me completely naked. Yeah. So now that I don't have 6 packs, actually, it's not a good idea. But you can kind of see when neighbors tell you like, oh, you've really gained weight. And you can kind of see that you've not put the curtains down. So, but this intensity and this relationship is very much prevalent. And so to bring the idea of a traveler as opposed to a tourist in sort of experiencing our building was very important.
So these are those useless interstitial spaces that we kept intact and not bring them into the rooms when originally I think the developer wanted us to, gain square footage and bring them in the rooms. But this is to kind of allow the public, whoever that just comes to the building, can find and get lost within the building in the past. So the next project, I think the next 3 projects, we have to go through them really, really quickly. This one is in Sichuan, where the spicy food is from. And this is Emeishan, where for thousands of years, it's this important kind of spiritual icon in the memories of poets and literatis and artists. And it's a very sacred kind of Buddhist site. And when we were given this was a competition that we won 3 years ago, the brief was to create a new home for the first malt distillery that's being created by Pernod Ricard. And at the time, we had no idea what brand it's going to be, because they're creating an entirely new kind of hybrid, because as we know, there is no whiskey brand coming from China, so they're creating kind of this Chinese slash, where is whiskey from? Scotland. Yeah, so Scottish Chinese brand in Emeishan. So the whole entire kind of conception of branding for us was a little absurd, but we took it on. And the reason I think we won the competition was we really brought up an idea of a very thought-provoking concept, both for the brand as well as for the architectural and interior concept, which is to kind of conceptualize a holistic dualities, setting 2 ideas that may be contrasting, but bring about kind of the notion that within the Chinese mindset that these things can actually become holistic. So the way that we're conceiving, I think this talk, we're questioning nature and also culture, and possibly seeing them as kind of contrasting ideas. But here we have 3 ideas. One is shan shui, which is mountain and water, and seemingly contrasting, but together these 2 words actually means landscape in Chinese. And then the other 2 said clear and strong. They speak about the palette of the spirit. Qing means clear, and Lie means strong, but together it also means kind of the palette of a spirit in Chinese. And then the third one is old and new, start and beginning, and 始末, together these 2 words mean history. So I think, for people who understand the idea of these three sets of words, they become to be a very seductive kind of concept for this new brand. And here we're just going to go through how the journey starts for the visitor. You go through this kind of reception area, and yeah, this is where you start as a visiting center, and then you can see kind of this mound across the field. And this mound also takes on the idea of the ruin, wherein the ruin in the original Chinese text, qiu means a small mound. So the mound also acts as the space where you're going to have this journey. You can just keep on clicking. So journey of seeing the site and seeing the way that the distillery is making the drink, the whiskey, and then also you land in this place where you can kind of look up and see the water dripping, and you can hear the water, and then the tasting rooms are through the different doors. And then here is the iconic moment where you see the mound, and then you see the Emei-shan, the mountain right behind it. And also experientially, you can walk up on the mound, and then you see the way the distillery is made from afar. And here it's after you come out of the tasting room and also the restaurant, you can have another moment of seeing kind of that iconic mountain, that form which recalls kind of this spiritual moment of Emei-shan. Yeah. Oh.
So the third project, Rossana thinks by clicking her computer, it automatically clicks, but I'm actually the automated. I know, it's my job. So that's the reason why we've been together for a long time. I just have to say she's right. So the third project is called The Void. What was interesting about this project was when the client came to us, he is notorious, one of the best actually developer in China today. And he has about 7 different properties. What he does is 80% is housing, and actually 90%, and he takes 10% and he goes around and hire people like Tsubujimoto, Junya Ishigami, Vector Architects, and all these architects who do cultural institutions, so libraries. So when he called us, we were really excited because we said, wow, Vector has this library, Open Architecture has this museum. And so we said, of course, yes, without looking the site. Yeah, it was really stupid on our end because it was 3 hours by car from Beijing, and his argument is people are so hectic in the city that they need to go out and have this second home. And by luring home, he believes that culture needs to be brought into his development. So it's not just about housing. So it's a kind of this cultural tourism strategy on his end. And by bringing culture, people would then go to these places on the weekend and feel like as if they're not missing out on the activities in the city. So when we came, he said, this is your site. And I said, what happened to the seashore and the beautiful things that you gave all the other architects? How come you have this fake Mediterranean village? They're all very new. They're not even, he goes, oh, but don't you think this is very European and you will like this? I'm like, this is crazy. He says, can you build a rock for me? And so what we did was we really recreated this idea of this almost introverted space. We created this gigantic black rock, like kind of solid rock, having this unit very much inspired by Marcel Breuer, and the idea of creating this gigantic rock cast in place. Amazing construction, actually, on their end. I was kind of surprised. And then created this circle, bringing in sky. So I said, well, you're not going to give me the water. Yeah, so I'm going to bring my own landscape. Yeah, and so the field down below actually is filled with water. And it kind of waves around, and then if there's activity, the water would get drained, and then there would become a culture. So this becomes this landscape. We don't have butterflies like Wilfried, but we have the sky and the water. Granting water is a little bit polluted, and performance. So there is a film here. Oh, it went back. So this circular void, this is actually the museum component for this development, and quite an interesting show. They have pleased the last 2 years. But what we did was we actually circle around the notion of the landscape, the idea that the landscape was the central aspect of this particular building, and everything was around it. So it's many different levels around the project. So due to time, we have 2 more projects. My superior, who I worked for, told me to go straight. So I'm just going to go flip through this rather image. This is a project in Shenzhen, but I'm just going to go through the film immediately, which speaks very similar idea of the project. This is the existing building because the film doesn't show you that. And what we're trying to do is we're wrapping kind of a beautiful coat around it, and we're cutting a stairway that leads you up. What's interesting about this film is this is the first time we're actually working with our son. So he filmed. We're not trying to be Rem Koolhaas. We're in, his son or his nephew is trying to do the film, but he's a filmmaker. And the first time he showed this, we're saying, where's our building? And he told us, well, your building is part of the community, right? That's what you said. So we were going to show you the film very quickly. And I think most of them will speak for itself. So this is the stairway that leads you up. We did a section that takes you the street that leads you up to your rooms. So this is a 9-room house for the developer that, quite interestingly enough, I will describe to you more. Oh no, that's a very important film. It is there. So rhinophilia and rhinophos means collapse, but it is usually about remainders and reminders. I want to suggest a different logic of the ruin, which is not romantic, not baroque, not melancholic, but a form of toleration of disharmony, a toleration of plural modernities with which we live. Rediscovered, Svetlana Boym says, of modern ruins are not only symptoms, but also site for a new exploration and production of meanings. What's interesting about this project is the fact that Wang Ke, the developer, took over the old Shenzhen. If you know Shenzhen, south of China, the central business district have blossomed, and this old village that was once the central part of Shenzhen has died the last 25 years. Left to decay, what they did was they took over and took 200 of these buildings and promised all the owners, we're gonna renovate it for you, but you rent it to us for 20 years. And by the time it's over, this house, which is renovated, will be all yours. So 200 of them were designed by really good architects, above what we call above average architects. They call it above average architects, and then they hire 20 architects for their marketing purposes, people like Sejima and VRDV, to do the cultural projects. And what's interesting was the challenge of this was to reinvigorate the old city and come alive. We were given this project, not so much cultural. They said this is going to be a house. So it's not a hotel, it's almost like a Kezan. And Kezan is a resting station. And so we experimented with many different things, taking on the old southern gate as part of the division between bathrooms and the sleeping area. We custom made a lot of the furniture within that region in the southern district. And the idea was to take this old building and patch it like an old grandmother, just patch it with concrete. Didn't change much of it, concrete. Made the window sometimes bigger just because it needed to be. and then clad it with a beautiful coat. We also cut through the stairway, you will see. You see the building, the old building is still there, yeah? And with patches of concrete. And what we did was we created this beautiful stairway that leads you from the piazza, that leads you all the way up to the rooftop, and it creates this new datum line, a new courtyard, a new garden you will see up above.
It's a city that's been criticized in China for a city that has no history, but of course that's not true. And this specific area is called a village within the city, and it's probably the most kind of the place where you can find the remnant of what used to be there in a city wherein now it's just dominated by concrete and high rises. Okay. You want to click on? So the final project, I think you should also show the. So
this film is the one that you guys saw yesterday. For those of you that were there, we do have a different film. Not to say that it's probably more architectural, the film. You want to talk about this?
Yeah, so this is the existing site that we were given before the project started. So as you can see, it's basically kind of like in a ruinous state. And the only image that we should probably concentrate on is Geyuan. So show them. So we did a lot of kind of research in this famously touristy town called Yangzhou, and this is a city wherein the history is very important. But we found this very interesting kind of garden, and it's a garden that was built in 1818. And the idea of Chinese gardens during that time is about the holistic nature and coherence of man-made, which, as you can see, the gardens are really man-made. It's not the nature that you think of in a English landscape, for example. But in that ideal, the kind of cosmic ideal is built into that whole design. And also the architecture is very much integrated within the landscape design. And here is the building, and it's a nice square building. And what became really interesting, and we were taken by these lanes that are really acting as fire lanes. So when one house burns, it takes a while before the next one is burned. But there's also a symbolic kind of point to these lanes. It's called Guan Cai Xiang. And Guan Cai together means coffin. Of course, it's, bad luck to want something that relates to death. But Guan also means official and rise up in rank. And Cai means wealth. So then it becomes a very auspicious thing to want to rise up in rank, to have good fortune, and to gather wealth. And then, so the entire project then became, this is the existing site. And what we did is, so you can see like how we basically just used that Guan Cai Xiang with the lanes, and that became kind of the journey into every space. So, when you walk through the reception, to the wellness center, to the spa, to the breakfast area, you always go through these lanes, and it's just kind of obsessively done so that you often probably will get lost, not even knowing which lane you are in, where you're going. But it's that idea of walking below the walks, and also when you're above the walks, you then see kind of this new horizon, and you gain a new landscape, seeing the views around this beautiful slender lake where Yangzhou is. We can go to the video. And of course, a very important aspect of this is that these are recycled bricks that are found all over the nearby villages. So basically, we asked the client and the contractor to go around the different villages and find different recycled bricks. And in the film, I think you can see certain kind of details of bricks, and because they have these different emblems, probably speaking to the different workshops that made these different bricks. And sometimes they're patinas of yellow or red or green that you can see how basically these different bricks from the different areas are just put together to form one wall. And we thought it's a kind of a beautiful, material, tactile way of understanding how bricks can gain new life.
What was interesting about this project was that the owner had this vision that cultural remnants and cultural sites cannot just be limited to the big building that you understand it today when you go to China, like the Great Wall, or like the Forbidden City or the Summer Palace, that there are smaller areas outside of just Beijing and Shanghai that are important. So he went around places like Xiamen, places like Yangzhou, and took on the idea of the Slender Lake, those tulou, round houses, and he started taking sites around those areas and have places of respite for tourists and travelers to come to understand the rural nature of what made China what it is today. And he argued, so he hired 5 Japanese architects and 5 Chinese architects to really rethink this whole idea of restoration and what cultural landmark means. And so we were really on board with him. In fact, he was so adamant about making sure that the brick or we were adamant, and he agreed, that we went around the villages next door. In many ways, a brick is a unit, but together it becomes a community that comes together. It was interesting because the contractor, he also insists on local contractors, so it's rather roughly made. We had a whole set of working drawings. They literally threw it outside, and they're like, could you just explain to me how this is going to be done? They had markers, and they wanted to see renderings, so it was really frustrating when we were building this, but to my surprise, a lot of the bricklayers actually taught us a lot of things that we never thought would be possible. All the furnitures also were made locally. They were not the usual furniture that we do for the Italian brands or the Scandinavian brands, where they're very thin and they're a bit bulky. But because of that, the locality becomes interesting. And he also was conscious in hiring people who were going to bricklayers, people who are really good at their craft, but because of low wages, who would have gone to the city and become drivers or janitors. He brought all of them back, and he believed that by actually employing them properly, that the community comes alive and that they could be with their family. So it's not just about restoration of material. It's not just about this whole idea of reflective nostalgia in terms of just the physical entity, but it's also a whole neighborhood. So Rossana and I, when we started our practice 16 years ago, it was a difficult journey, but we took that position because we understand that there is a meaning to what we do. And despite the fact that globally everyone talks about the China that copies, China that likes gleaming towers, China like only like new things and flashy modern things, we argue that there is a group of people once told of a narrative, once given a history of their own, once they understand the lay of the land, will actually start to appreciate what architecture can do. And so there's a good, if you see the reuse, recycle in MoMA, we were really excited because a whole new generation have cropped up out of this craziness that we started. People often call our place, Neri, who was an institution. We waste money training a lot of people, and after 3-4 years, they do their own thing. Rossana always say they become our competitor. I actually don't think that, because they become a community of believers, a community that come together as Antoine de Saint-Exupéry once said, we do not aspire to be eternal beings. We only hope that things do not lose its meaning and purpose. And our role are just, both Rossana and I were just the bridge maker. And hopefully the next generation of Chinese architects, product designers, interior designers, will be able to create fresh, innovative ways that hopefully will be able to contribute back to the world as opposed to just copying the West. And that he closes the door. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I want to ask each of our today's speaker, please come on stage. We have roughly 10 minutes for our discussion, but light lunch is waiting outside, so maybe we can carry out a few questions and conversations during our light lunch. I first want to thank all the speakers for their tremendous presentations, and the overlying theme, and Wilfried, not knowing what my intention was when I curated this event, was because I wrote the abstract and the title of today's symposium 3 years ago. Then the pandemic hit, and well, I started to think about time. And this is something you all have in common in your work. Wilfried mentioning the thing that landscape architects think in ages, whereas architects should start to think for a longer period of time. Lina, you talk about archaeology of the future. Kathrin, you work with real-time augmented bricklaying, and Rossana and Lyndon, you of course work with reflective nostalgia and also giving this view on what could be possible and for future generations, what is the role of architecture by connecting nature and culture. And I just want to give the audience the chance to ask questions and maybe comments. Are there any urgent questions or remarks? There is a microphone in the back of the room. Anyone? You're also impressed by the great presentations. I can see it in your faces, yeah. Okay, so, okay, one question here. Please, just 1 second. Here's the microphone.
Actually, it's not urgent question, as you suppose, but it's just a question. Just 3 points, and then I will have my question. One is that we talked about robotics, and but let's scale it up a bit and talk about technology. It's driven over the years by the industry in the sake of economical reasons. Yeah, it was not for the art or architecture. As the robots and technology are developed, it was mostly for increasing the efficiency or reducing the cost and so on. And the other point, Lina talked about like this touch of a human on the facade, that how valuable it is to have this human touch on the architecture works. And then Kathrin showed very well that how the robots and human could collaborate and so on. So my question is that how do you see this whole scene, whole theater of the robots and the humans? Is it more contrasting, or I believe it's more complementary? I just gonna see or listen. How do you see the whole setup? More complementary or contrasting? Because maybe there is some contrasting point, but yeah. So that's opening up some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for this question and remark. Lina, Kathrin, who wants to take up the microphone and... It's on, it's on, it's on, it's on.
Ah, yeah, okay. Well, thank you for the question. Well, we research in digital fabrication, and I think the notion typically is that we are asked to advance technology for building with machines of some sort, no? And I have the feeling that, I mean, I come from a background where I just really enjoyed making things. Somehow, I started to be going into the direction of technology, as I was always kind of working with digitality. But at the same time, I'm also the biggest critique myself towards these technologies, no? Because more and more I feel like if they don't, like, it was really beautiful what you said about not just the nature deconstruction, but also the cultural deconstruction that we kind of experience. And I have the feeling in the last 10 years, even more and more, I have the feeling if we don't start to look into not just the nature that we deconstruct, but also the culture that we lose, the knowledge that we lose on how to make things, and also sort of not just being a very specialist group that knows how to make things, but the general communities that know how to do things themselves, right? So to not be completely dependent on any sort of industrialized process of some sort. No? So this is somehow, I don't really know how to address it, but somehow this keeps coming back to as a topic, and I have the feeling that, of course, we look into technology, but at the same time, I think we have to create an extremely critical kind of standpoint as to how we gonna engage with them as especially in the future that is coming. So yeah.
Maybe to draw on what you said.
It should be on.
Yes. Yeah. No, just I feel like actually technology is, I mean, what I mean by the archaeology of the future is also the capacity of bringing back primitive techniques and knowledge of material into the future. And somehow robotics and what you've been showing, what's interesting is it's allowing us to go beyond the industrialized process and to kind of bring something much more customized. And that's what's, I think, fantastic, is to be able to kind of bring difference, more of specifics, more of cultural diversity through the use of robotics. It was interesting when one time I presented the project of Beirut in Spain on a forum actually talking about technology and architecture. And there was my opposite office that presented almost the same texture, but printed with robotics and like kind of this layering. So it is a kind of fascinating like a confrontation between both that could be very much complementary.
Someone else wants to ask a question? Yes, there is a gentleman right there.
Presentation. Yeah, I was really impressed because each of you had slightly different insight into, let's say, our architecture, our life. And my question sounds, because we could see really great projects, yeah, which are displayed on the boards. But at the same time, I say that our world, especially huge cities, metropolitan cities, are something different. This is not about, let's say, architecture, what we can see. You know, this is not because normally the cities are built by normal people, built by informal way. And my question sounds, how we architects can, let's say, improve our environment in terms of, let's say, some architectural, let me think how to explain that. I'm a little bit stuck now and nervous. Yeah, because we architects normally design very formal way, yes. And it's very hard actually somehow to impact larger scale, you know. And as Neri architects, they say somehow they're trying to preserve some informal way, even to encourage that way, you know. And I see that still we are driven as architects by ego to design everything by formal way. And I think that in terms of 21st century, in my opinion, it doesn't work. Even as we can see, like preservation of environment, we try really hard during the last 50 years somehow to preserve and protect nature, but in fact it doesn't work. So sometimes I say we are lying to our pockets, that we are improving the world, but in fact I'm optimistic, but at the same time I'm very depressed. So the question is, how to improve it? Of course, you said that you are sort of like the bridge, yeah, for next generation, which is absolutely, I think, true. But at the same time, my question sounds, yeah, maybe a robotic way, industrial way might help, but at the same time, we are losing sort of identity, in my opinion. So the question is how we can impact in larger scale our, let's say, especially human environment. Maybe a complicated question, but that's my sort of depression. Thank you.
Who wants to pick it up? Okay.
I think that's a very good question. Rossana and I went to Omnibud about 10 years ago, and we saw Le Corbusier's building, we saw Charles Correa's building, we saw Louis Kahn's building. And I remember after seeing Louis Kahn's building, I turned to Rossana and I said, I quit architecture. They've been doing amazing things. This is 50 years old, 60 years old, and we're not even as good as them, right? I was really depressed. I left that place. But then when I left, about an hour, and I saw all the surrounding area, and I'm like, okay, I need to practice again, right? Because 95% of the world today is not done properly. We were in Milan before we came here, and people said, Neri and Hu, you guys design a lot of chairs. Do we really need another chair? And I paused, and I thought about the question, and I said, actually, yes. Because 95% of the chair in the world today is garbage. The problem is not creating new chairs, but eliminating the 95% bad chairs. And if we can take that 5% and make it more interesting, it would not be so bourgeois, you know, it won't be so, it becomes what Achille Castiglione has done, it becomes actually very good value for a good chair. But right now it's because these are so few, the 5%, it gets glorified in Milan, it becomes really expensive to build, expensive to make, right? So to answer your question in a long-winded way, I think it's important as architects not to just practice and practice and practice. That's important, but I think it's important to also educate, to teach, and you can't just expect the younger generation, but clients as well, and brands. So even, I know this is a BRIC award, we also have the responsibility to tell all the manufacturers what's important. So it's not just a commercial entity. So we've dedicated ourselves to teaching. We've created a platform in Shanghai when we bring thinkers just like this, you know, but because it's China, it's so large, so 1,000 people would be listening to people like David Aja or people like Pedro Elrichhausen. They come and they speak, right? Product designers, architects, and interior designers. So our role as architects, we can't just be building buildings because that change is very limited. We have to teach to the next generation, but it's important that that teaching is not just limited to school, but to clients as well. Rossana always say that, oh, Lyndon, you're always trying to change their mind. You know, it's very tiring, Lyndon. You're constantly changing the client's mind. You should just quit a long time ago. I said, yeah, their mind needs to be brainwashed and changed, yeah, because that's our role. And if we're not going to do it, who's going to do it? We're just going to sit there and we're going to say, oh yeah, they don't understand. We're so much better than them. But they have the money to build, so we need to change their mind. So my goal is a very practical solution for you, is that don't give up. And I think we need to be a bit more multidisciplinary in our approach and not just so singular. Oftentimes architect likes the big A and just like, if I don't get to do the building, forget it, you know, if I can't. But if you can help in other ways, I think that would start to affect change.
Just one thing to add. I was in Évora in Portugal 2 weeks ago. Once again, I studied there in Lisbon some while ago, and I went back there to see work by Álvaro Siza, which is the Quintana Malagueira, which is a residential development that I saw as a student 30 years ago, and I saw it again now. It was under construction since the 70s. And it's a complex that is so amazing. It's done by the, I think, best architect in Europe that is still living and producing architecture right now. It was done so many years ago, and it's still not finished. And the question why it's not finished, it's not because for lack of funds or because the plan is ongoing, but it's because the way it is being designed is to never be finished, because actually the people who move in can change their houses. They can actually adopt them, adapt them, and change them, and actually become co-authors. So maybe one way of answering your question is also to say, we as architects should not pretend that we do the final touch.
Rossana, do you want to add something to that?
I was going to say I really appreciate this question, because I think, you know, often in conferences like this, it becomes very kind of insular, and then we're all looking within the discipline and speaking within the discipline. But I think those questions open up the discipline to engage in many other spheres that I feel like needs to start within the school. Now that we're very much involved in architecture education, I think one of the first things that we need to do is to open up the discipline so that we are engaging in technology. I definitely don't feel that engaging technology would yield worse architecture, whereas I think a lot of the traditionalists feel that then the forms would suffer, and a lot of the, you know, kind of the ethos within the kind of the big ideas of architecture would suffer. But in fact, I think it's because we don't understand technology enough that we cannot engage it the way that the, you know, early modernists were able to successfully engage the technologies during their time to produce, you know, great form. And the question is about also, you know, how do we engage form with everything else that's around us? Is almost like beauty within kind of that scope of the disciplinarian platform is no longer relevant. But I would say that the kind of, you know, duality of thinking, you know, beauty versus ugly or new versus old, I think that's also a kind of transformation in our way of thinking needs to happen, is that things don't really need to be against each other, but then it's like the project that I was introducing on the you know, dualities, that, you know, they don't need to be extremes that are at the opposite end, but two extremes can actually come and be coherent and produce a more kind of equilibrium world. So in that case, it also means architecture needs to engage with other disciplines the way that I just talked about.
Thank you so much. And I was asking this big question at the beginning of our little symposium of how architects can make a substantial contribution for the built environment. And it was my intention as the curator to bring various approaches from within the discipline of architecture together for a discussion on, and I know it's a very bold title, Architecture Connecting Nature and Culture, but I think what we learned is that you cannot separate the digital from the actual, you cannot separate nature from culture. It's intertwined. I think we can be positive and optimistic of what the future can hold, and how we as architects, designers, engineers can be a part of shaping this future, and be persistent that it is good, and talk to the clients and talk to the stakeholders. So with that in mind, I once again want to thank the amazing speakers. I want to thank each and every one of you of attending. I want to thank everyone who is watching via live stream. And once again, thank you to Wienerberger for sponsoring this event. There's light lunch waiting outside, so we'll move the discussion out there for everyone who is staying a bit in Vienna and wants to learn more about architecture and can't get enough of architecture. There is an exquisite architecture exhibition here at the Markt just next door called Missing Link, Strategies of a Viennese Architecture Group. And all symposium attendees are granted access by your Brick Award wristband. And well, that's a wrap. Thanks for coming and enjoy your afternoon. Bye-bye.